Good morning, good afternoon to everyone. We are waiting for participants to join us. Welcome to this meeting, Enough is Enough, a conversation with international human rights expert on privatization and public services. My name is Magdalena Sepulveda. I'm the Executive Director of the Global Initiative for Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, and I'm connected from Mexico City. This event has been organized by 9 civil society organizations working on issues related to privatization, public services, and human rights. They are Action Aid, East African Center for Human Rights, the European Network for Debt and Development, Eurodat, the Global Initiative, the Initiative for Social and Economic Rights, OCFAM, the Society for International Development, Public Services International, and the Transnational Institute. The organizers, we would also like to thank the Heinrich Böll Stiftung, who have provided financial support to this event. Today, 8 UN experts from different mandates have come together to discuss privatization and public services and issues that have not yet been discussed much, except for some important exception in the human rights sphere. I'm going to introduce the panelists that are going to be presenting today. In alphabetical order, they are Mr. Philip Alston, Professor of Law at the New York University, former United Nations Special Rapporteur on Extreme Poverty and Human Rights. Mr. Juan Pablo Bohoflavsky, Professor at the National University of Rio Negro in Patagonia, Argentina, and former United Nations independent expert on foreign debt and human rights. Ms. Kumba Bolibari, UN Special Rapporteur on the Right to Education. Ms. Leilani Farah, Global Director at The Shift and former United Nations Special Rapporteur on the Right to Housing. Mr. Leo Heller, UN Special Rapporteur on the human rights to safe and drinking water and sanitation. Ms. Tlatlen Mofokeng, UN Special Rapporteur on the Right to Health. And finally, Mr. Olivier de Schutter, UN Special Rapporteur on Extreme Poverty and Human Rights, and former UN Special Rapporteur on the Right to Food. We are also grateful that we seem to have also connected with Mr. Pedro Arrojo, who is going to take over Mr. Leo Heller in 10 days. So we're going to invite him to provide some comments at the end. We are very grateful that so many UN Special Rapporteur and former Special Rapporteur have joined this important discussion, which we believe the 9 organizations behind this, it is quite rare and exceptional and show the importance of the topic. Over the last few decades, we have seen the increased privatization of services in a range of sectors, from education and health to water and food and housing. This has been highlighted as a major threat to the realization of human rights, particularly economic, social, and cultural rights. The issue has become critical in recent years, particularly in the context of rising inequalities and climate change. The COVID-19 pandemic and the economic and social crisis it has generated have exposed and exacerbated the danger of a model for service provision that is driven by profit, and have emphasized the importance of a strong, effective public institutions. This is a crucial time to discuss how we can ensure that services essential to the realization of economic, social, and cultural rights are owned, managed, and delivered in a way that serves the public good. The discussion today will be organized as follows. We will have 4 mini panels of about 15-20 minutes each, where various rapporteurs will provide remarks. In order to interact, and for all those who are connected, you can submit questions to the question and answer setting of the Zoom. And we also invite everyone to comment on the discussion in the chat function. We are expecting, we're having now many participants. We expect more to join us. So it is quite likely that we might not be able to ask all the questions, but we will keep them and we will try to work on them lately. We also want to encourage to everyone to tweet if you're able, and you do that using the hashtag #TheFutureIsPublic. We are going to start the discussion, and I'm going to ask the same question first to 3 of our panelists. I'm going to ask Philip, Kumbu, Leo, and Leilani, sorry, for the following question. And we are going to start with Kumbu, then Leilani, then Leo, and then Philip.
No.
What do you see as being the key human rights issues raised by the privatization and commodification of goods and services in your areas of focus? Kumbu, you can go first.
Thank you so much, Magdala. I will speak in French, and it's a pleasure to join this dialogue. Je voudrais vous remercier très sincèrement de m'avoir associé, bien sûr, à cet espace de dialogue important sur les services publics de qualité, mais surtout sur toutes ces problématiques et ces enjeux de la privatisation, mais particulièrement de la marchandisation des services publics. Je voudrais très sincèrement, avant de démarrer, remercier le Global Initiative, mais aussi avec l'ensemble des autres réseaux de la société civile qui ont porté ce processus depuis plusieurs années maintenant, parce que c'est depuis 2016 que les réflexions ont été entamées sur ces questions-là de privatisation, mais aussi de marchandisation de l'éducation. Je voudrais vraiment les féliciter et leur dire toute ma solidarité parce que ça a été un combat important pour l'humanité. Le deuxième message que je voudrais dire, c'est aussi remercier toute l'équipe à la fois de ce réseau, mais remercier tous les experts et toutes les expertes qui ont contribué dans ce processus vraiment de construction, par exemple, d'un outil qu'on a appelé les principes d'Abidjan, qui vont permettre bien sûr au pays d'être guidé et d'être orienté. Et enfin, je voudrais aussi dire un message de plaisir d'être ici avec mes collègues, à la fois anciens rapporteurs des Nations Unies, mais aussi actuels rapporteurs spéciaux des Nations Unies. Je voudrais vraiment les remercier d'avoir accepté cette collaboration. Et je voudrais dire un merci particulier à Léo Heller pour lui dire tout simplement qu'il est à la fin de son processus, bien sûr, de rapporteur spécial des Nations Unies. Et je voudrais vraiment lui souhaiter, I wish you all the best, Leo, for the next step. You have done a wonderful work for our humanity. And for that, I am really thankful. And thank you for your collaboration during these years also as a partner and how to build better together. Thank you. And le dernier message sur lequel je voudrais insister, c'est les enjeux. Les enjeux sont énormes parce qu'ils sont à la fois financiers, mais ils sont surtout relatifs aux droits humains. Quand on parle de cette problématique et surtout de son impact sur le droit à l'éducation en ce qui nous concerne. Comme vous l'avez dit, depuis quelques décennies, on voit qu'il y a un accroissement énorme des privés au niveau du secteur de l'éducation. Et dans certains pays, ça varie entre 10 et des fois, en fonction du secteur, ça va jusqu'à 90%. Par exemple, le préscolaire, on voit qu'assez souvent dans plusieurs pays, ce sont 90% qui sont concernés par le secteur privé. Ça veut dire tout simplement qu'en quelques décennies, il y a une flambée, un accroissement énorme de la présence, mais surtout aussi du pouvoir et de l'espace que ces acteurs privés sont en train de prendre au niveau du secteur de l'éducation. Et les conséquences sont bien sûr des conséquences énormes. Et mon rapport en tant que rapporteur spécial des Nations Unies présenté à l'Assemblée générale des Nations Unies en 2019 montre à la fois ces enjeux, ces défis, mais aussi fait des recommandations au niveau des représentants des États à travers, bien sûr, un outil que nous avons appelé les principes d'Abidjan. Et les principes d'Abidjan ont été vraiment construits avec à la fois des experts, mais aussi des décideurs, mais aussi des acteurs les plus concernés par le système éducatif. Et je pense que c'est un instrument fondamentalement utile sur lequel les pays devraient s'organiser pour pouvoir s'assurer qu'ils prennent en charge cette question de privatisation en termes d'encadrement. Donc, pour commencer, je pense aussi qu'avec le Covid, il faut reconnaître que la situation est en train de s'empirer. Et pour nous, quand nous avons des messages forts, comme celui de son Excellence, Monsieur le Président Macron, le président de la France, qui dit qu'il faut qu'on reconnaisse que la leçon fondamentale à tirer au niveau des services publics aujourd'hui, il faut vraiment reconnaître qu'il y a des lois en dehors du marché pour certains secteurs, bien sûr, publics. Et je pense que ça, c'est un message fort, vraiment qu'il a lancé. Et en tant que décideur politique, je pense que c'est fondamentalement important. On a vu dans certains pays comme le Maroc, où Sa Majesté le Roi du Maroc a décidé d'accompagner les enseignants et les enseignantes du secteur privé qui n'ont plus été payés pendant la période du Covid. Ça veut dire que l'impact vraiment de la privatisation de l'éducation, à la fois sur les droits humains, le droit des enseignants, mais aussi les droits des apprenants et des apprenantes, c'est vraiment des défis et des challenges énormes. Et pour nous, il va falloir continuer à adresser très fortement cette question-là. Merci beaucoup. Je m'arrêterai peut-être à ce niveau-là en disant aussi qu'il y a beaucoup de pays africains qui ont revisité leurs lois. Ils sont dans cette dynamique-là depuis l'apparition, par exemple, du Covid, pour dire que les lois doivent pouvoir changer par rapport au privé et par rapport, bien sûr, à ces lois du marché pour s'assurer qu'il y ait un peu plus d'effectivité du droit à l'éducation en ce qui concerne, bien sûr, cette question-là de droit à l'éducation. Merci beaucoup.
Merci beaucoup. I'm going to remind all those who are just joining us that there is translation in the bottom of the Zoom, so you can choose the language of your translation. And I'm also going to remind the experts that this first round is 5 minutes, and you are also invited to respond to any of the points that your colleagues are also saying. I'm going to give now the floor to Leilani. Leilani, do you have the floor?
Thanks so much, Magdalena, and thanks to the organizers of this incredible and perhaps historic event. Really pleased to be here, though it is early morning. My brain is not fully functioning. Truth be told, I've got a big cup of tea, so hopefully I'll get through the next 5 minutes with some coherence. As you know, my area of expertise is in the right to housing. But given that the bulk of housing worldwide has already been privatized and only part of housing systems are generally public, and in light of the complicated scenarios from a privatization point of view of indigenous lands and informal settlements, the human right to housing sits at a really particular position, or in a really particular position in a conversation about privatization. That's not to say that this conversation isn't relevant. It's hugely relevant, but it's relevant in a very particular way. What I thought I would do is just talk about two ways in which I am quite concerned about privatization, or perhaps it might be better for me to talk about the commodification of housing, or even the Uber commodification of housing. In particular, what I noticed as rapporteur over the last 6 years, particularly in developing economies, is the imposition of private mortgage-based housing schemes dressed up as social housing. I saw this, for example, in my country visit to Egypt. Basically, these sorts of schemes pretend to extend to those in housing need housing through social supports by the government, but they end up basically precluding those most in need, the poorest populations, who can't scrape together, for example, a down payment or a deposit or make monthly mortgage payments. These are schemes that are actually imposed by the World Bank, or proposed by the World Bank, but really imposed by the World Bank. And I assume the rationale is that they provide liquidity to state-owned banks, basically off the backs of the poorest people or some of the poorest people, and as a means of kickstarting debt-based economies. The concern, obviously, from a human rights point of view, is that those most in need are not actually accessing that housing that is purported to be social housing. The second phenomenon of concern that I'll raise, many of you have probably already heard me speak about it, is the financialization of housing, or what we call the financialization of housing. Here, I'm not talking so much about mortgage-based home ownership schemes. I'm talking about institutional financial actors, corrupt money, and individuals of ultra high net worth, billionaires who together are trillionaires, who use housing or residential real estate as an extractive industry, as Saskia Sassen says, where they use residential real estate to park, grow, leverage, and hide big capital. This involves obviously private equity firms. Those of you know I've gone after Blackstone in this regard, but it also involves pension funds, and often public pension funds. Some of the largest state pension funds are engaged in this. I had a long conversation with a pension fund in Korea, third largest in the world. They're engaged in this. The Norwegian pension fund, I believe, is also one of the biggest in the world, if not the biggest, and they're engaged in this. The other manifestations of this kind of financialization, many of you will know, living in different cities around the world, Airbnb, that's a financialized model of residential real estate. Golden visa programs that many of you may know, where you can invest a certain amount of money in residential real estate, and then you get citizenship or residency rights. Those are all manifestations of financialization. What's the problem with these from a human rights point of view? They take what would otherwise be long-term and potentially affordable housing off the market. They disconnect tenants from their landlords, which can be hugely problematic. For example, if there's a global pandemic and you can't pay your rent and you want to renegotiate that rent in developed countries, who's your landlord? A shareholder, perhaps in Singapore. And we also know that the financialization of housing is really driving up the cost of housing globally, making housing basically unaffordable and therefore insecure. Affordability and security of tenure are two hallmarks of the right to housing. So those are my chief concerns, and that's my 5 minutes. Thanks so much.
Thank you very much, Leilani, and for keeping to the time. So we have heard about education and housing, and now we're going to go to Leo to hear about water and sanitation. Thank you,
Leo. Thank you, Madalena, and congratulations for leading the organization of this essential event. I hope that this event can open up a door for more substantive discussions on this very key issue. Some of you may know I recently submitted my last report to the General Assembly, which I will present this Wednesday, about the theme of privatization of water and sanitation services and the risks to human rights. The motivation for the report was that the privatization of these services since the 80s has started to expand, actively promoted by international financial institutions. This promotion is still in place with different and more diversified formats. As a result, part of the world population currently receives services from the private sector, It's around 10% of the population, but it's still a huge amount of people that is receiving services from private sector of water and sanitation. So for identifying risks for the human rights in the report, I developed a kind of risk framework that allowed me to show why and how privatization of water and sanitation raises concerns from the human rights perspective. The framework is based on a combination of three factors that particularly affect the water and sanitation sector. The first factor is profit maximization. That is very important in the water and sanitation sector. Several experiences show that the private companies tend not only to make profit, but also to maximize their profit. The second factor is the natural monopoly that is a characteristic of the water and sanitation sector. In this sector, we have only one provider, differently than other sectors, education, housing, telephony, etc. And the third factor is power imbalance. That is particularly common in the water sanitation sector when you have a big company interacting, engaging with local governments, sometimes weakly organized. So using this framework, I identified a number of issues raising concerns for the realization of the human rights. And I used a series of examples from several countries to illustrate those concerns. I can exemplify some of the risks identified. First, the lack of usage of the maximum of available resources. Often when you have privatization, part of the national resources of subnational resources are drained out from the water sector. Deterioration of services because the providers are reluctant in investing in extended services for the poor, for the unserved. Unaffordable access, there are several evidences of high prices affecting particularly the most vulnerable parts of the population. The issue of sustainability is very common that when the contracts are coming to the end, the provider is not using the resources to expand the services and to ensure sustainability after the concessions, for instance. Lack of transparency, lack of accountability, inequality, leaving people behind. Usually the private provider is selective, choosing to provide services only in areas where profits are ensured. So it's important to highlight that those services are naturally public, and privatization requires a decision-making process. So states, both national and subnational, need to consider those risks when deciding whether or not to embark on this type of provision model. I'll stop here, Madalena, and available for the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Leo. Now we give the floor to Philip.
Thanks, Magdalena. It's a great privilege to be with such a wonderful group, and it is terrific that all of the speakers, at least, have really been engaged in these issues and have contributed importantly. First of all, I think that we have to be careful, while acknowledging the importance of the different sectors, education, water, housing, and so on, to acknowledge that privatization is not just a sectoral problem, but a problem across the board. I think that the most commentators, most analysts in the human rights field tend to have looked at it in one particular context or another. And of course, in each context, it has its particularities and so on. But the bigger challenge, I think, is the extent to which what I would call the other side, the pro-business lobby, those who are promoting neoliberal economic approaches, have succeeded in completely reversing the presumptions that apply in so many of these different areas. They've effectively reversed the burden of proof, whereby if you are suggesting that a function should be performed by a government, you have to demonstrate somehow that there is an overwhelming need for a government to do it as opposed to private business, because the assumptions are that the latter will always be more efficient, always be less corrupt, and always produce better results for the society as a whole. So we've got a sort of distortion of the common wisdom in terms of how people view this. And I'm not talking about people in the business sector, I'm talking about the average citizen who has now been convinced that this is the logical way to go. I think it's important for those of us who have worked in the UN system to acknowledge the key role of international organizations. The World Bank really personifies this, thanks to Jim Kim and the marvelous work that he did before he bailed out in order to go and make even more money in private equity. The bank has adopted this presumption, basically, that funding should not be provided to governments for many different functions unless they can demonstrate that the private sector is simply incapable of doing it. The IMF, despite all of their denials and so on, has always very consistently been pushing for privatization on the assumption of great inefficiency. And the UN, through the Sustainable Development Goals, has also become a powerful proponent of, quote, private-public partnerships, which effectively suggest that the SDGs will and can go nowhere in the absence of private funding, and therefore all of the relevant arrangements must be adjusted and adapted to make way for the private sector. I think that's deeply problematic. A couple of final points. First, we have to recognize that this is not just a challenge for economic, social, and cultural rights, but is every bit as important in the field of civil and political rights. There is, after all, no function of government that could not actually be privatized if the will is there. All of these different services, whether it's justice, whether it's detention, whatever it is, can be performed by the private sector. And finally, just to come back to the poverty mandate, clearly the biggest losers in privatization, just by definition, are low-income people. Because, as I've said often enough, if I was in business, I would be seeking to make money. I would not be seeking to take on the most demanding population, the ones who have the least money available to extract. I would be marginalizing those groups. That's a natural way for privatized businesses to go. And so if governments abdicate their responsibilities in any given sector, it's low-income people and those living in poverty who are always going to be the first and the greatest casualties. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Philip. Before I'm going to ask the next question now for the next speaker. And after that, we're going to open a time for question and answers. We have received many that we will be asking. So but we also invite all of you to respond to yourself, to your colleagues. The next question is, what do you see as being the position of human rights regarding the role of the state state, and of other actors that may be perceived as public, such as community group, in the provision of goods and services relating to human rights. And in this round, I'm going to ask Tlaleng, Olivier, and Juan Pablo to respond. So Tlaleng, you have the floor.
Thanks, Magdalena. Do you mind just repeating the last part of the question?
I was muted. Yes, I will repeat the question to all. It's a long question.
Yeah.
What do you see as being the position of human rights regarding the role of the state and other actors that might be perceived as public, such as community groups, in the provision of goods and services relating to human rights?
Thank you. So I think, it's important to remind, all of us that the right of everyone to the enjoyment of the highest attainable standard of physical and mental health is related to multiple other human rights, and that it's indivisible. And so for us to succeed in terms of, everyone's right to the enjoyment of health, we have to be committed to ensuring that other rights are promoted and respected and protected. And, I'm just thinking now about how the right to dignity, right to information, freedom, security of the person, the right to equality and non-discrimination, bodily autonomy are so important when we're talking about access to health. And the fact that we are discussing obligations of the state. And it's often when the state or public health has no internal capacity to give services to the public that they then tend to outsource these services. And in some countries, it's the issue of tenderization or the tender system, where it's then used to outsource or procure very essential services. And I think that's where most of the corruption and maladministration and over-dependence or reliance on players outside of the public health system who don't have the same obligations as the state then happen. And I think, even with COVID-19, what we've realized is that, even at our best as a global community, we were not really prepared in terms of health systems planning as well as resourcing. And so mine is always a question of, when we're discussing privatization, it's about where the power lies in these decisions, and the fact that there is a power asymmetry in public health, and the fact that there has to be a promotion and protection of human rights. And this is reliant on the redistribution of power in funding, in clinical, in research, and public policy settings. And the decision-making power currently still concentrated in the hands of biomedical gatekeepers, philanthropists, the pharmaceutical industry. And this raises concerns currently, but also moving forward in terms of, provisions for holistic care, issues of governance, innovation, and independence. So I think it is important to also highlight that because there are so many players that are interested in public health, and many are there for profit making, that this concentration of power then also mimics a hierarchy of sorts. And it's concentrated in very classist, racist, and neo-colonial ways, and often impact who sets the agenda, what are the indicators, and unfortunately priorities. And you will find that there is misalignment or a malalignment with what communities on the ground have identified as their own priorities versus what funders and private sector have identified as priorities, again, in the quest for profit making and privatization. And we have to push back and really protect the right to health, and really make sure that the commodification of human rights doesn't happen, because many people, especially who find themselves in vulnerable situation, whether because of age or class or gender or sexual orientation, even issues of migration, those people and those situations that have already been established as grounds for discrimination, they require us to protect and to promote their human rights, and ensure that vulnerability does not lead to rights or violations, abuses. I will stop here, Magdalena, and wait for the second round. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Olivier, you have the
Thank you, Magdalena. Very great pleasure to be with my esteemed colleagues and friends. I'll try to answer directly your question and look forward to the second part of the discussion when alternatives shall be explored. And let me start by mentioning that we have, strangely, in international human rights law and in international law more broadly, strong norms against expropriation by the state of private individuals or corporations. But we have no strong norms against privatization, although privatization is, in a way, expropriating all the community from the assets that it has contributed to building and maintaining. And often these privatization processes are irreversible, given the protection that then goes to the private company that has bought these assets, often at discount prices in the context of structural adjustment programs or of large privatization programs in countries shifting to the market economy. So I think it's a fundamental problem, this imbalance between the protection against expropriation on the one hand and the non-existing protection against privatization on the other hand. Now, why is this a human rights issue? I believe for essentially 4 reasons, and that is my answer to your question. First, as Philip Alston already mentioned, obviously, privatization means that access to certain services or goods essential to lead a decent life shall be made conditional upon one's ability to pay. And here one, I believe, underestimated norm that we should use more frequently is the prohibition of discrimination on grounds of social origin or property, as stipulated in Article 2, Paragraph 2 of the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. When you allocate particular services in areas such as water, health, education, housing, mobility, on the basis of one's ability to pay, well, per definition, it is much more difficult for people in poverty to afford those particular services, and that may amount to discrimination if it is leading to exclusion, particularly where much more viable alternatives could be explored. The second human rights norm has to do with accountability and participation. We should recall that states are monitored by the voters, at least in countries that organize regular and fair elections, whereas corporations are managed by directors, CEOs, who actually have a duty to maximize the shareholder value. That is the fiduciary duty that is imposed on them. They cannot put their own interests or views above those of the shareholders, the real owners of the private enterprise. And that prioritization of the shareholder value above anything else in the strategic decisions made by the company is reinforced in recent years by the compensation packages that CEOs receive, often including shares of the company to align their interests with those of the shareholders. So the decisions are made not in the interests of the general public, not in the interests of the promotion of human rights. They are made in the interest of shareholders, and that is a second major problem. I mentioned accountability. I should mention participation also. Obviously, in many companies, the boards making the strategic decisions are composed by representatives of shareholders, and neither workers nor communities affected by the activities of the corporation have any say in these strategic decisions. Even the German Mitbestimmung system, co-decision system between the board of shareholders and the representatives of workers, is not really a bicameral system as we should in a democratic enterprise. So that's the second concern. A third concern is financing. We know that for services to be consistent with the realization of human rights in the sectors of concern to us, water, sanitation, education, health, housing, and so forth, the financing of these services should be based on progressive taxation schemes and and would therefore be redistributive in nature. Instead, once a service is privatized, it is based on the very regressive system in which the funding of the service is provided by users paying fees. And that is remarkably regressive. I mean, even the health insurance provided under Obamacare, which costs around $12,000 per year per person insured, is regressive in that sense, because it actually is money paid by the employer for the beneficiaries, reducing therefore the wage that the employee is paid, and that is not financed through general taxation systems. So and it's private companies who provide then the healthcare insurance. So I think it's a major problem, the financing scheme that privatization leads to. Fourth and finally, the way the resources a society has at its disposal are used is distorted by privatization. Let me explain. Markets respond to demand as expressed by the purchasing power of those having an ability to pay. Markets do not respond to needs. And so where a particular service is privatized, the way investments shall be made, the kind of medical treatment offered, whether we should provide water to swimming pools or to poor households will depend on whom can pay, at which conditions. And obviously, the desires of the ultra-rich shall take precedence over the essential needs of the ultra-poor. And that is deeply inequitable. Markets, if you wish, are a sort of great auctioning process resulting in a plutocracy in which the richest have as many votes as they can pay for, and in which people in poverty have very few votes to cast. And finally, and that goes to the previous point, the privatized undertaking, the privatized service shall prioritize the short-term profitability concerns over the long-term concern for sustainability. Why? Well, because shareholders expect immediate returns on their investments, and they care little or not at all about the long-term sustainability of the business or the impacts to the environment. So for all these reasons, the way the resources shall be used is deeply distorted as a result of privatization. So these would be my 4 points, and I look forward to the second part of the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Olivier. Juan Pablo, you have the floor.
Can you hear me well? Good morning and good afternoon, everybody. Big thanks to Magdalena for organizing this meeting first. And I want to follow up on one of I want to make a legal bank for keep on pushing for private schemes, even in the context of the pandemic. So
Juan Pablo, we are not hearing you well. Maybe if you put your video out so we can improve the audio. Juan Pablo, can you hear me? We are going to move then. We're going to wait to see if Juan Pablo's connections improve. And we're going to move to the set of questions that we have now. We have received from the speakers, and all the experts are invited to respond. If you just raise your hands physically, I will give you the floor. So the first question that we have is from Fons Commons, and he's asking the panelists to address how they define the concept of privatization. Does it mean that a government hands over public services to the private sector, or does it mean giving more room to the private sector as part of a process of commodifying and commercializing key services driven by profit? Who would like to go first to respond your definition of privatization for the discussion? Leo, you have the floor.
No, it's a good question. I don't think there is a consensus in the literature about the definition of privatization. For my report, I needed to choose a definition, and my definition was the participation of the private sector in providing services for a long time through concessions, private partnership. And I excluded from this definition, for instance, community-based organizations, NGOs that provide services, and also the participation of the private sector in more subsidiary activities like design, engineering design, construction, etc., etc. So basically, I used the concept of companies providing services for a long time.
Leilani, do you want to go? Yes.
Sure. So I have really focused on a particular part of privatization, the financialization of housing. So because the bulk of the world's population lives in already privatized housing. So it's complicated for me to try to challenge privatization as a whole, though I do completely agree with the comments of Philip and Olivier, those sort of more macro comments about the problems of privatization, and those do apply to housing, obviously. But what I've tried to do is focus on kind of the thorniest or maybe the most explosive aspect of privatization right now, which is this issue of the big institutional actors and the big institutions engaged in really ridding housing of its social content, of its human rights content, of its human rights value. As Olivier so aptly said, ridding it of people and making it only about finance profits and short-term profitability. So that doesn't mean that I don't recognize privatization in other ways. Social housing, for example, in many countries is being privatized and was privatized after the global financial crisis, Spain being a really good example. Austerity measures forced upon them, I should say, although they didn't push back, the selling off of public assets such as social housing. So that's how I've been looking at it. It's I'll talk a little bit more later in our discussion, I think, about the problems in completely rejecting privatization in the area of housing. You can imagine what an uphill struggle that might be when the bulk of the world's population lives in privatized housing.
Thank you, Leilani. Kumbu, go ahead. You are muted.
Yes. Thank you.
Yes.
Excellent. Je voudrais juste dire que je suis d'accord avec la vision globale de ce concept de privatisation. C'est vrai qu'on essaye assez souvent de mettre aussi en relation avec, bien sûr, le public. C'est-à-dire, quand on parle de privé et de public, c'est tout le travail de participation, de prise en compte du secteur, bien sûr, privé dans le domaine de l'éducation. Et c'est vrai qu'on le met toujours en contrebalance avec la part du public. Donc, tout ce qui n'est pas privé est bien sûr public. Mais au-delà de la recherche un peu de cette définition de ce concept beaucoup plus large, en se disant que la privatisation touche énormément l'ensemble des secteurs sociaux, moi je dis, pour nous, au sein de l'éducation, nous essayons de faire une différenciation entre ce concept peut-être de privatisation qui peut concerner la délégation ou la participation de tous les acteurs non étatiques. Mais à côté de ces acteurs non étatiques, vous avez aussi au niveau effectivement de ces acteurs une sorte de différenciation, et Léo en parlait tout à l'heure et puis les autres collègues aussi, par exemple tout ce qui concerne la société civile, tout ce qui concerne une association de familles, tout ce qui concerne voilà, ces organisations non gouvernementales ou tout simplement ces fondations qui décident bien sûr de s'impliquer dans le domaine de l'éducation, mais qui respectent les droits humains et qui respectent les droits civiques, sociaux et culturels. Ça c'est pour nous, ça c'est vraiment essentiel de faire cette différenciation-là. Parce qu'à côté de l'ensemble de ces acteurs dits privés, il y a aussi ce qu'on appelle les acteurs qui s'occupent, qui sont des acteurs vraiment commerciaux, qui s'occupent de rechercher intrinsèquement le profit. Et beaucoup de collègues en ont effectivement parlé en disant que le premier élément fondamental de la marchandisation de l'éducation ou de la marchandisation de certains secteurs sociaux, c'est surtout l'accent mis sur la recherche d'abord du gain. C'est la recherche d'abord du profit. Mais on ne s'occupe pas et on ne s'intéresse pas aux droits humains, aux droits sociaux. Et c'est là aussi où il y a effectivement des défis fondamentaux sur lesquels il va falloir agir.
Thank you very much. I'm going to put to the panel another question that we have received that is related. So this is from Jamie Burton. He would like to know the panel's view regarding is privatization inherently incompatible with the use of maximum available resources, or is it a case of inadequate implementation regulation, in which case reform is possible? So that it's a question to all the panelists. Anybody would like to comment on that question or on the previous one?
Yeah, Magdalene, I'll take a few moments. I think what's really important, because we have to position the discussion within a human rights perspective. And, you know, states are ultimately, you know, obligated and responsible for right protections and for the realization of these rights. And so in terms of accountability, there's only so much that you can do in terms of private sector and holding them accountable. Their mission and vision in their businesses is not around human rights. You know, it's about profit making. And so I still struggle with, you know, the idea that you can have public-private partnerships that are ultimately and overwhelmingly to the benefit of the public and vulnerable people. If you think about how issues of mental health, for example, issues of sexual and reproductive health, issues of you know, transgender and issues related to gender-based violence and post-trauma support, those issues continue to be in the margins. And even with public sector plans and planning and programming, they continue to marginalize that and replicate that. And you can't hold them accountable on that because they pick and choose what they want. And I think that's what's actually contributing to this, you know, everybody working in silos and only looking at their disease profile or whatever condition affects them. And the siloed approach is actually what makes the ground fertile for disintegration of public health services and lack of proper planning. I think also it's important to talk about, you know, the impact of global health politics and some policies, because in many communities, especially in the global south, those who are already vulnerable, those who are already marginalized, who cannot afford, even if they wanted to, private care, still depend on public services. And if those public services are themselves and the governments and the states dependent on foreign aid that comes with conditions that are harmful, that don't promote or enable a rights-based approach, it means it's those same communities again who are already vulnerable, already in the margins of their own communities and society, who are again going to suffer, even with private public partnerships, even if it's NGOs who do some of the work that the government outsources. In many countries in the global south, and especially in Africa, many countries are still grappling with the negative impact of the global gag rule, for example. And so it doesn't matter what the local constitutions are or what the national policies are. some of the global health funding and financing and the contracts and the clause that come with that promote criminalization. It promotes a lack of access. And unfortunately, some rights abuses are then enabled by some of these funding mechanisms. And so within and depending on how you view these issues of decolonization of global health, many of us and then colleagues across the world are currently discussing what does decolonization of global health looks like. And I don't think we can have that discussion without talking about this reliance on donors, on philanthropists, on foreign aid for essential health services, especially in those countries that are marginalized. And medical insurance, it's another player in this field that even the underwriting is discriminatory and sometimes prejudicial. They don't cover even contraception for women. They don't cover safe abortion procedures. They refuse to cover transgender health and hormones. And again, even those who can still afford private care or private insurance, because of these vulnerabilities, they are still left behind. And so there is a bigger question that we need to be asking about, what does health care and health rights look like within a capitalist system that is itself inherently already vulnerable, or at least marginalizing certain people? And is it possible within that framework to on how many economies are set up around capitalism and what it means, for health in general. And also, if you're thinking about issues of, non-communicable diseases, people often, exclaim in horror about how many, Black women particularly are still dying, even in the United States, as well as in Africa, of cervical cancer. And yet, when you are looking at programs around screening, it seems as if things are okay. Women come for screenings, and yet they are still dying from this disease. And partly it's about people not realizing that workplace policies around leave, around fair pay, impact women's ability to seek help and do so timeously. And again, we have public systems that don't prioritize non-communicable diseases. You have women who then have to, out of their own pockets, go for private practitioners for services. But even those who can afford don't have leave. They don't have leave days to go back for their results. By the time they are able to take leave, it's another year later, because women have usually used their leave to take care of their children's needs, after school needs, and all of those other requirements. And so even the delay in accessing healthcare can often be linked to workplace policy and gender inequality in the workplace, which is again a capitalist system. So the impact, the disproportionality of impact, and the negative health outcomes are multisectorial. And for us to succeed in any area, we need to make sure that every aspect of society is human rights based in its approach. And all of us have to understand, and that's what COVID has reminded some of us, although we didn't quite forget those who are in the front line, is that unless all of us are thriving, none of us can thrive. And we need to move societies from a place of just purely surviving and scrambling for resources to a place where we can truly thrive and get holistic care and services that are affirming of our human rights. Thanks, Magdalena.
Thank you very much. Now I'm going to instead of going to the next question, it seems that Juan Pablo's connection it's better. So I'm going to go back to him and then I will continue. Juan Pablo, if you don't put your video, let's try it.
Yeah, can you hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you well. Great.
And just when the wind blows in Patagonia, the connection becomes very unstable. I'm sorry about that. I was saying that I want to follow up on one of the issues that we mentioned in our op-ed regarding household debt and privatization. And I want to make a legal argument about the responsibility of the World Bank for keep on pushing for private schemes, even in the context of the pandemic. So the World Bank has announced at the beginning of the pandemic already a lending package of $14 billion with the hope of increasing said amount several times within the following months. So instead of using it health, nutrition, and population division, most of the lending is channeled through the International Finance Corporation, in spite of its non-existent experience in the development of a public health system and of the catastrophic result of public-private association in the health sphere. The rest of the funds is aimed at supporting healthcare directly, but it remains unknown whether it will finance public health system or if it will finance private clinics. This second option seems to be the most plausible, since lending to private companies within the health sector is planned in the available credit line. So the World Bank is actually embracing its private sector first maximizing finance for development approach. Actually, the IFC has allocated already 8 billion in financing in response to the pandemic, and has been stressed even in the World Bank blogs that healthy cooperation with the private sector will be more important than ever as countries exit this crisis even more fiscally constrained. So what, my question here is, what is the position of human rights regarding the role of international financial institutions in this context? So let me remind the basics. According to international law standards, international financial institutions can be held responsible for complicity for pushing economic policies that violate human rights. The knowledge of the wrongful nature of the act can be presumed if, even when pushing economic policies that we know normally lead to human rights violations, such as the privatization of a number of public services, no ex-ante impact assessment is undertaken. To my knowledge, this is an exercise that no international financial institution has undertaken, no impact assessment before going ahead with further privatization of public health service. So international organizations are responsible for actions and also omissions attributable to them which constitute a violation for their own obligations. This principle of independent responsibility is paramount throughout the International Law Commission's draft articles on the responsibility of international organizations. So while international financial institutions can be held responsible for the commission of this international wrongfully act, responsibility can also result from the provision of technical or financial assistance to a state that is the ultimate perpetrator of human rights violations. So if these financial institutions can be held responsible for the avoidable harm done to those affected by the finance dam, for example, why shouldn't they be responsible as well for the avoidable human rights damage produced by financial policies that knowingly violate economic and social rights? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Juan Pablo. Before going to the next set of questions to the panelists, I wanted to ask them if they would like to reinforce one point on the questions that we have put forward, or stress a point set by any other colleague. If you raise your physical hand, I could see you and give you the floor. No? Okay, so I will move to the next set of questions. Until now, we have addressed, several points from a sectoral point of view, but also more generally for what are sort of not only the sectoral problems, but the problems of globalization, privatization more globally. Now, the next set of questions would try to explore from the panelists what are their views about alternatives. What do you think are a rights compliant approach to the provision and delivery of goods and services? Do you know of any example of a good or a promising practice that you would like to raise with us? But the question now goes to alternatives. I'm going to give the floor first to Olivier to answer this question.
Thank you very much, Magdalena, and thank you for raising this question about alternatives, which I see has been asked quite frequently in the questions and answers box of this webinar. I think it's important to indeed explore alternatives by looking at the background ideological discussion that my esteemed colleague Philip Alston already raised. The pressure to privatize is based on essentially three arguments in favor of it at an ideological level. First, there is this argument that property rights are efficient, ensuring that the resource in question or the service in question will be provided in the most efficient cost-benefit analysis terms by actors motivated by the search for profit. So they will make the right investment choices and will be competitive, making the best service delivery possible. The second argument is that state-owned enterprises are not subject to the market disciplines and therefore shall be mismanaging public funds, not being forced to be efficient in their use of resources. And the third argument is that often state-led services have been mismanaged or corrupt, not serving the public, but instead misusing the resources put at their disposal without effective accountability, since the voter, in fact, is not in a position, because of asymmetry in information, of really controlling whether the managers of these public services are delivering adequately. Now, there are, of course, counter-arguments to this. We could say on the first point that there is a tragedy of the anti-commons, right? A tragedy of privatization that leads to exclusion. And so even though it may be on the surface efficient to promote property rights as a way of allocating services, it in fact it leads to increased inequalities and to practices that are not efficient at all. The argument that state-owned enterprises are not subject to the discipline of the market forgets that many large private enterprises, in fact, have such a dominance on the markets and represent so large an interest in the economy of particular countries that they shall be bailed out in cases of problems, and that they shall discourage the emergence of any competitor. And finally, privatization, one might say, is the ultimate stage of corruption, because privatization means you provide services to those whom can pay, just like a public service provider who is corrupt shall provide the service as a matter of priority to those who pay for it, albeit unofficially and informally. So I think we need to move beyond the private-public distinction here. And maybe the most promising alternatives are to be looked for in areas where communities have managed to build their own ways of providing goods and services essential for decent life in areas such as water, health, food, housing, etc. And I'm delighted to see that over the past 10 years, perhaps, particularly since the Nobel Prize in Economics was awarded to Elinor Ostrom, greater attention has been paid to the commons as a third way, if you wish, between the market and the state, between the private and the public, between private companies and state bureaucracies. And this idea is one that is, I believe, very congruent with human rights concerns, particularly because of the idea that the commons should be managed by participatory governance schemes, should be inclusive socially, should not prioritize the profit motive above everything else, and should ensure the long-term sustainability of the management of the resource or of the provision of the service. And we have in many areas, housing, food, energy, mobility, these commons-based governance approaches that have developed in recent years. And I'm delighted that the Global Initiative on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights shall be joining forces with the mandate on extreme poverty to explore this in greater depth, because I think it's probably the best answer we can give, that there are alternatives to privatization and to state bureaucracies to promote these alternative views or alternative models, if you wish, that fit with the social and solidarity economy. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Olivier. I'm going to continue with the question on alternatives to the other panelists. Leo, you have the floor.
Thank you, Madalena. You asked me about examples of well-succeeded alternatives to the private delivery of services. It's difficult to provide a conclusive response because it would require a comparative analysis, which we know is very challenging in methodological terms. However, in the water sector, there is a feeling of from many civil society organizations and practitioners that public services would be more appropriate based on the risks I have mentioned in my report. One indication for this is the massive wave of remunicipalization processes of water and sanitation services that is taking place all over the world, from developing countries to developed countries. From La Paz and Cochabamba in Bolivia, Buenos Aires, Jakarta in Indonesia, to Paris, Berlin in Europe, Atlanta at the US. In the last 20 years, several of these cities remunicipalized services due to unsatisfactory level of the private provider. And there are hundreds of documented cases of deprivatization. I use this term deprivatization in my report. So there is this feeling of the better performance of public services, particularly because there is the need of a decision-making when it comes to privatize water and sanitation service. There are also some good examples of community-based organizations, even self-supply of water and sanitation. One emblematic situation has occurred during the pandemic, the COVID-19 pandemic. Associations of water service providers, largely driven by private companies, for instance, in Spain and Brazil, expressed concerns about economic sustainability of companies and their right to maintain disconnections practices for those who do not pay their bills. In the opposite direction, the necessary protection of people in vulnerable situations through the provision of water for all, regardless of their economic capacity, was widely adopted by public operators and advocated by civil society organizations. So this was an example on how the private provider usually looks basically for their needs to make profit and not to the needs of the most vulnerable parts of the population. So basically, I cannot say that there is an ideal model. This is very contextual. But again, the risks for human rights from some models, such as the private model, need to be seriously considered in deciding how to deliver services. So, sorry not to respond to you objectively, but I really think that the context matters in this discussion.
Thank you very much. This question is very important because we're always blamed that the human rights movement never talk about alternatives, but we do, and we advance also positive alternative. Olivier mentioned the commons, Leo mentioned the remunicipalization, community-based organization, and also somehow, although he referred only to the water section, it seems that COVID has sort of bring the public back. There has been an overall discussion in several sectors of the need, and citizens seems to be open to the discussion. So I'm going to give now the floor to Tlaleng in order to see again the question about alternatives or promising models, and then I will start asking to the rest of the panelists some questions from the audience. Tlaleng, you have the floor.
Thanks, Magdalene. I do think, I just want to encourage, the colleagues and other attendees who are listening to please, do reach out to the various offices at the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. I think it's important for us to actually continue to learn and engage with broader community, to gather information and to really come up with recommendations that take into account all the governmental players and all the different civil society organizations, and come up with really strong recommendations that can be implementable, but also that we can, all of us collectively support, because I do think we need collective vision. I think it's only when we all are learning continuously, perpetually learning from each other, that we can do best for the different regions. And I do think there's a need for more regional support and regional work, because the issues are different, the priorities are different, and with COVID-19, we know with the move for the people's vaccine, it's so important to talk about again the positionality and where power lies, and talking and furthering these discussions and developing a deeper understanding on issues of intellectual property and trade. And we know that India and South Africa recently proposed a resolution around this important work of intellectual property around this vaccine development. And I think that's one area where we can, all of us, demonstrate actively this new vision that we want, and we can then come up and recommend appropriate measures to promote and protect the realization of all these rights. And I do think there's something to be said about research. I think when all of us can use evidence and research to inform our work, it will really be great. And I welcome colleagues to share widely their resources and their research and data that will then be used to further deepen this conversations. And of course our work it overlaps, and what we don't want is duplication, but I think amplification is what will get us faster to the sustainable development goals. 2030 is only now 10 years ahead of us, so it's important. I think when you're looking at the successes, there are some private partnerships around maternal health, especially looking at issues of decreasing maternal mortality and morbidity. There are some programs that are looking at the issues of mortality and morbidity of children under the age of 5, and many of them are around prevention. There are some good practices in South Africa around HIV management, but again, I'm yet to see a program that fully fits the model for what we are advocating for as a human rights sector and as different members of society. And I do think we have to continue these discussions, continue learning, and sometimes we may have to commit and resource to creating new data and thought leadership in these very important sectors. But I really do think that societies in the global south, communities in the global south, have to have a seat in the table. We can't continue with the what we often refer to as the safari type approach, where people spend a few months in the global south and then they go back to their global north institutions and they become the experts and the mouthpiece of vulnerable and marginalized communities. So we need to rethink about whose knowledge counts and which knowledge is deemed to be acceptable. But of course, in terms of public health, the challenges remain in terms of acceptability of care. When we're talking about drug use, even mental health conditions, we know the issue of acceptability of care is very important. And that's where a lot of private sector rehabilitation centers and mental health clinic centers have come into the space, because public health is not paying attention to the issues of drug use and mental health. Unfortunately, they sometimes end up in the criminal justice issue, and they tend to take on that posturing as opposed to a public health issue. And I think, again, there are potential and pockets of excellence, but in the majority, I think there's still a lack of a human rights approach. And I think that's what's really important. It's the fact that people have to receive non-coercive treatment, and they need to be truly enabled to give informed consent. So even if issues of information access and access to information in the languages that you understand is key, to consent and making informed decisions. So I do think there are different, parts of the world where we can learn certain things, but they still yet to exist a perfect, public-private partnership. And I do think the issue of corruption and lack of transparency in the health sector generally plays a role to why there's a lack of trust in communities when it comes to health programming and private sector. Thanks, Magdalene.
Thank you very much. We're now going to move again to the question from the audience. The next one, it's maybe a technical question, but it's the most popular question now on the question and answer chat. And it will be to you, Philip. The question is about general comment number 3 of the Committee on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights. So for those who do not know, this general comment is about the nature of the state obligations. And the question is from Jackie Dugard, and her question is it the time to push for a successor general comment to the Committee on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, general comment number 3, which is neutral on the mode of service provision? I understand, Philip, that you were a member of the committee at the time and played, I think, a leading role on that general comment. So would you like to answer that question? Is it time to change the model of general comment number 3? You have the floor.
I'm probably not the right person to ask, Magdalena. I think it's fair to say I wrote every word of general comment number 3. I think the provision that Jackie refers to says that economic, social and cultural rights can be promoted in the context of any economic system, and it doesn't demand any particular approach. But that was very much written in the early 1990s, when one was trying to accommodate whether it was communist or socialist or capitalist or other types of economy, and to avoid being dragged into the debate as to whether a capitalist society, for example, could ever fully realize social rights. I think Jackie is right in the sense that if that those sentences are misconstrued as saying that a government can adopt any economic system it likes, I think that's wrong. But my real answer to Jackie would be, I think it's probably time to move on. General comment number 3 is now almost 30 years old. And I'm not sure, however, that going back and rewriting a general comment on the nature and scope of obligations, which has had a fairly big impact, would be the best strategy. I think we need to start devising and perhaps new general comments around the issue of where privatization fits into this overall scheme.
Thank you very much, Philip. And this is actually what several of the organizations that is behind this meeting are behind, sort of to push the human rights movement in a way to address more directly issues of privatization. Any of the other panelists would like? Leilani, you have the floor.
Yeah, I think that's such an interesting discussion. And I think I probably agree with Philip, time to move on and do some new things. I will say that that provision of general comment number 3 has actually been quite useful for me in my advocacy, because I can sit with a government and I can say, look, I'm not telling you that you can't have housing somewhat privatized. And I'm not telling you that you need more X number of social housing units. But what I am telling you is that whatever you do has to be consistent with your international human rights obligations. So in a way, that provision has actually been like the door that I walk through for some of my bilateral discussions. So I do see the problematic that Jackie raises, of course. I actually wonder whether this webinar doesn't lend itself to sort of thinking through what a new general comment might look like, rather than just rewriting general comment number 3.
Any other panelists would like to address that specific question? Should I move? I don't see any hands raised. I'm going to move to another question from the audience. And this question is about what happened actually when you don't have a very good state in a way. So the question is, I'm wondering how the expert might suggest we address situations where governments are inept and corrupt and failing to provide adequate water, sanitation, education, and housing to his residents. Is there any scope for fair collaboration with private entities? This question is from Sital Kalantri. Any of the panelists would like to address that specific question? Olivier, you have the floor.
Well, thank you. I think it's a absolutely relevant question. Just like we should not idealize the market mechanisms and operate a confusion between textbook economics and economics on the ground, we should not idealize the state bureaucracies, many of which all too often have failed the expectations and failed the people they're meant to serve. There's one major difference, however, between public bodies and private enterprises, which is the built-in accountability that public opinion, the media, civil society, voters exercise upon the delivery of services by public entities. But that is, of course, not to say that they are not very serious problems very often in the way the state operates, and particularly when we have no forms of participatory governance, no involvement at all of people, the communities affected by certain decisions, simply based on the idea that the state is representative of the public interests and that the government has been voted into power, that is indeed problematic. So the one good thing about this debate between the private and the public, although I should emphasize again the limitations that result from seeing things in that bi-dimensional spectrum, if you wish, the one good thing is it obliges us to take a very hard look as to how the state itself behaves in providing those services to the users.
Thank you very much. Leilani, you have the floor to respond.
Just really briefly, I had the good fortune of visiting both Egypt and Nigeria when I was rapporteur, and I think those two countries probably fall in the category of the question. What's so interesting is, of course, where the states are corrupt and failing to do what they should in terms of their international human rights obligations with respect to the right to housing, that extends right into the private sector and the government's relationship with housing providers, money lenders, etc. So there, in those two cases, that relationship is very tight and synchronous with each other. So I don't think that you could pivot to the privates and find some relief or some kind of implementation of the right to housing there, because there was such complicity. And that's true of many local and national level governments, where the government is very in cahoots with finance and corrupt real estate and corrupt development, et cetera. So that's a thorny one, at least where the right to housing is concerned.
Mm. And Magdalene, if I may.
Yes, go ahead, Tlalling, and then Leo.
Thank you. And this is such an important one because it speaks about accountability, because, you know, when things go wrong, many communities don't have access to justice. You know, getting governments to do the right thing often requires, you know, individual citizens, you know, to pay to access courts. And that's if the courts are themselves independent in a lot of the countries. And we know that many activists on the ground continue to experience harassment and torture and inhumane treatment at the hands of state state bodies. And so it's important to also, you know, communicate to people out there that if they do have information on alleged, you know, violations or abuses of the right to health, they can write to the UN Special Procedures Mandate independently. They can share that information, you know, with a different thematic. Sometimes the special repertoires are per country, and we can look at some of these issues around past human rights abuses and violations, or if there's any ongoing or potential human rights, you know, violations. I think it's important because a lot of bills, legislations, policies, they often get pushed very quickly if they are not really fully embracing and protecting of all human rights. And sometimes, you know, people realize after a bill has been passed that there may be problems with their approach around human rights. And some countries are unfortunately experiencing major regressions in terms of human rights, despite all the different resolutions, you know, from the different, you know, UN treaties and bodies. And so where policy or practice in country doesn't comply with international human rights laws and standards, I think it's important for communities and citizens around the world to realize that if they may not find it feasible or even safe to advocate actively in their countries, that the United Nations remains and should remain that space that they can, you know, access to try and sort out some of these human rights related abuses or violations, particularly on the right to health. Thanks, Magdalene.
Thank you, Leo.
No, very briefly regarding the last question. I think the rationale of the question is that when the states are weak, absent, corrupt, let's bring the private sector on because it will replace what the states are not doing. And at least from the point of view of the water sector, I don't think this is an adequate rationale, because for the water sector, the regulation of the provider is key, is very essential. And it's very common to have the capture of the regulator by the provider. So if the states are weak to provide services, it will be weaker to regulate the private sector. And I'm not sure. There are several experiences in the very, very poor countries where the private sector went and didn't provide a good service. And there are a push still today to do that. For instance, there is a case in Lagos, Nigeria, where the World Bank is pushing very strongly to privatize the services. And there are several concerns on how the state could be strong enough to regulate a good provision of service by these companies. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We're going to move to the last question, and it's a question that tried to look forward. So the question is, and here I'm going to invite all the panelists, it's what strategies and actions do you think will contribute to achieving a shift to a rights approach to public services? Are there institutions that you think should be targeted? How could we work together, civil society, experts, and other actors defending public services? So I'm going to start now with Kumbu. Kumbu, you have the floor.
Thank you so much. I want really to say again, congratulations, and finalize my speech in French. C'est vrai que comment peut-on faire et quelle stratégie pouvoir utiliser et quel pourrait être aussi le rôle de certains acteurs clés, bien sûr, dans ce processus un peu d'accès, mais surtout aussi d'accès de qualité des services publics. En ce qui concerne l'éducation, c'est vrai qu'à un moment donné, on a parlé des alternatives possibles. Il y en a eu. On a vu, par exemple, des pays où il n'y a pas eu d'État, où ce sont les familles qui se sont organisées pour assurer la continuité des apprentissages, mais pour assurer l'accès du droit à l'éducation à leurs enfants, en payant bien sûr des enseignants, en recrutant des enseignants, mais aussi en les hébergeant. Et donc, tout le système éducatif était entre les mains des communautés. Mais cette question-là, on peut aussi questionner en termes de durabilité. Que pourrait être en termes de durabilité une telle innovation ou une telle initiative du secteur privé, donc qui est des associations, bien sûr des familles, autour de l'école. C'est la question de la durabilité aussi de telles initiatives. Le deuxième élément important, c'est qu'on a souvent des ONG ou des organisations de la société civile qui vont voir aussi l'État, qui prennent des ressources, qui s'organisent, donc c'est de l'argent public international ou de l'argent public au niveau des États, qui organisent par exemple des dimensions d'effectivité du droit à l'éducation. Mais on peut aussi questionner ces acteurs, leur façon de faire, leurs pratiques. Est-ce que ces pratiques-là, ce sont des pratiques qui respectent les droits à l'éducation? Dans quelle mesure ces organisations, ces ONG internationales qui interviennent sur le terrain ne sont pas justement en train de faire du profit? Et ça, c'est aussi des questions. Est-ce que les ressources qui sont récupérées sont réinvesties dans le système éducatif ou pas? Est-ce qu'on tient compte des droits humains, des droits à l'éducation ou pas? Et pour moi, c'est un peu ces questions un peu de fond pour chaque type d'alternative. J'ai dit, pour chaque type d'alternative, il n'y a pas de... En fait, c'est vrai que la Convention dit l'éducation, c'est d'abord les obligations des États. Et ça, il faut vraiment que ce soit très clair. Pour nous, au sein de l'éducation, pour nous, l'éducation, elle doit être à la fois publique, elle doit être gratuite, de qualité et inclusive pour chaque citoyen et pour chaque citoyenne. C'est ça le principe. Mais à côté, on peut avoir effectivement des acteurs privés qui agissent. Mais ces acteurs privés doivent être encadrés. Et quand je dis encadrés, nous avons la perspective, par exemple, des guiding principles d'Abidjan, qui sont les principes d'Abidjan, qui sont là et qui permettent justement d'encadrer chaque type d'acteur privé. Et ça, c'est important que les États s'approprient un tel instrument et l'utilisent, bien sûr, dans le processus de collaboration et de participation de ces acteurs privés au niveau de l'éducation. Enfin, j'ai dit aussi un point important qui a été abordé par l'ensemble des panélistes, c'est la question de la redevabilité. Je dis bien, quel que soit le système, quelle que soit l'alternative, que ce soit le système public organisé par les États, que ce soit un système privé organisé par un acteur communautaire ou de la société civile, etc., etc., tant qu'il n'y a pas un mécanisme de contrôle, de redevabilité, tant que ce mécanisme interne n'existe pas, il peut y avoir des biais. On peut arriver à ce qu'on ne respecte pas les droits, les principes du droit à l'éducation, à la fois en termes d'accessibilité, en termes d'accessibilité, en termes aussi d'adaptabilité et en termes d'adéquation des moyens. Et pour moi, c'est ça le plus important. Quelle que soit l'alternative proposée, qu'elle soit à la fois publique ou privée, j'ai dit l'essentiel, c'est qu'il y ait la participation de chaque acteur. On lui donne son espace d'expression, qu'il puisse s'exprimer, mais surtout que la redevabilité de cet acteur qui met en œuvre soit vraiment interrogée. Et je crois que si on s'accorde sur ces principes, on va pouvoir avancer. Les stratégies, j'ai dit, il faut aussi s'assurer que quelque part, la recherche-action, parce qu'il y a encore des informations que nous n'avons pas, bien sûr, sur tout le travail que ces organisations, par exemple, de la société civile ou ces ONG au niveau international organisent dans le secteur de l'éducation. Ce serait bien qu'il y ait une étude, par exemple, qui démontre aussi quelque part par A plus B qu'il y a une sorte de respect des principes du droit à l'éducation au niveau de leur façon d'agir. Ça nous permettrait de capitaliser, de tirer des leçons et d'avancer. L'autre dimension, pour moi, qui est essentielle, donc en plus de la contribution des chercheurs, c'est aussi la contribution de la société civile qui doit être toujours là, et il y a des exemples concrets au niveau, par exemple, du secteur de l'éducation. Global Initiative, avec d'autres acteurs, se sont organisés quand il y a eu des secteurs privés, commerce, marchands, qui font de la marchandisation de l'éducation, ces organisations de la société civile se sont tout simplement ont utilisé la loi et ont utilisé aussi la communication, les médias. Et ça, je crois que c'est vraiment très important. Et sont arrivés à bout pour obliger ce secteur privé à revoir sa façon de faire. Et ce sont des exemples concrets. Je pense que quelque part, on a par exemple le Global Partnership for Education, le JPE, qui à un moment donné a voulu introduire le secteur privé dans sa stratégie, mais ce sont les acteurs de la société civile, en collaboration bien sûr avec le système, en tout cas avec la rapporteure des Nations Unies que je suis, mais aussi avec d'autres acteurs gouvernementaux qui ont interpellé et on a abouti à quelque chose de plus convenable. Mais je pense que c'est ce travail d'interpellation, c'est ce travail aussi de dialogue qu'il faut pouvoir continuer et poursuivre entre nous. Et je voudrais encore très sincèrement vous féliciter et vous dire qu'en tant que rapporteur spécial des Nations Unies sur le droit à l'éducation, nous restons tout à fait disponibles et il ne faut jamais oublier cette dimension d'interconnexion des droits à l'éducation. Et le Covid l'a montré et l'a démontré encore une fois qu'en ce qui concerne justement l'effectivité du droit à l'éducation, la santé, l'eau potable, les maisons décentes, l'économie, tous ces droits sont interliés et interconnectés. Et il va falloir qu'on l'interroge. Et par exemple, tout ce qui concerne aussi l'éducation à distance. Aujourd'hui, avec l'introduction des moyens, hein, des technologies de l'information et de la communication, je pense qu'il va falloir avoir des recherches sur cette dynamique-là en termes de droit à l'éducation et quelle pourrait être justement la proposition pour pouvoir avancer parce qu'on rêve des plateformes, pour moi, gratuites, mais aussi démocratiques et inclusives. C'est ça qui va aider, bien sûr, dans la perspective à organiser cette dimension d'effectivité du droit à l'éducation. Et je voudrais vraiment, encore une fois, vous remercier et remercier l'équipe du Global Partnership, mais aussi tout le réseau. Et dire aussi que souvent, Magdala, ce sont des êtres humains, ce sont des individus comme Sylvain Aubry, comme Delphine, comme Sally, comme vous-même. Et ça aussi, des fois, on oublie que derrière ces belles initiatives, ce sont aussi l'engagement et très sincèrement le courage intrinsèque de certains êtres humains qui sont derrière ces initiatives qui poussent malgré les adversités. Et je voudrais vraiment vous féliciter et vous dire encore de poursuivre parce que c'est fondamentalement important de continuer à interroger cette dimension-là de privatisation, mais surtout de marchandisation des services publics. Je ne parle pas seulement de l'éducation, mais aussi de l'ensemble des secteurs publics. Merci beaucoup.
Merci beaucoup. I'm going to pass the floor to Philippe, but before that, I would like to try to bring some of the questions from the audience in to ask you for this to include in your response. During your time as a special rapporteur on extreme
Right. Did Magdalena disconnect? Okay. I think the question she was about to ask when she was giving you the floor, Philip, if I may pass on while Magdalena is back. was a question around, again, around the spirit of how do we move next. And one of the options that's been discussed in the chat and the Q&A is whether having a document like the Abidjan Principles, I guess it kind of connects the question about the mutual comment. But is there a document, a charter, something some of you or all of you or some or broader group come up with to try to clarify how can human rights be really a tool to help advance the discussion on privatization? So with this, I pass it to you, Philip.
Thanks. I feel sorry for Magdalena at the critical moment. So I think a couple of really closing comments in a way about the strategies and then a response to that specific question. I think we have to acknowledge that privatization is not actually inherently fascinating or easy to grasp for most people. It's very obscure, and I think most even human rights people just say, oh no, that's a 1980s debate, not interested, I'm moving on. I think it's important for us to remember that it's always useful to point to human rights standards and arguments, but they're not going to win the battle in this area. And simply repeating, any provision of a treaty or whatever is not going to change the minds or the policies in this area. I think we, as was said before, need to very much move beyond the binary, should it be public or should it be private, one or the other. There's one clear starting point, it's the only one really, and that is normative or philosophical. Governments have an obligation to ensure an adequate standard of living for all their people. And if that is not being done, then the government is failing in its essential obligation. And it certainly means that in areas like education and health in particular, because they're the easiest in a way, governments absolutely have to retain control one way or another. Whether it's through very careful regulation of what the private sector is doing or through direct provision or some creative combination. I think the key in so many ways is the need for an evidence-based approach. This thing that struck me most when I started researching privatization is that there are actually no studies that demonstrate that privatization has positive impacts, particularly on the poor. And even the World Bank says, yes, we haven't done those studies. We can't give you an answer. And despite that, there is this deep and abiding ideological view that, of course, this is always the most efficient. Finally, the question about whether a new declaration, such as the Abidjan Declaration, would be desirable. Certainly, I have no difficulty with that, but I think we also absolutely need to start working in coalitions. We need to get out of the human rights ghetto. We need to work with, whether it's political economy groups. Eurodad does terrific work, another excellent report last week. Some of the economists and others working on this, we really need to gather together more powerful coalitions and not just repeat the same old human rights mantras. That's the biggest challenge. Thanks.
Thank you, Philip. One Pablo, if your internet allows, on this question of alternatives and potential tools that might be developed to move forward this discussion.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Very, very well. Yes, thank you.
Great. Thanks. As we know, individual and household debt accounts for a significant portion of debt in most countries, both developed and developing countries. And we can see this even more in the context of the pandemic and the economic recession. And we know that this is a result of a series of economic measures, such as privatization of public services, and of course, austerity measures, which in turn fueling inequality and poverty. But my point is that at the core of this phenomenon lies the so-called financial inclusion. You know, that is, in my view, the colossal failure of states to ensure the realization of economic and social rights. And actually, the explosive increase in private debt is what has sustained aggregate demand and economic growth over the past decades. So my suggestion here, in terms of strategy towards a shift to a rights approach to public services, would be linking audiences, linking agendas and stakeholders operating on both fields, economic and social rights, focusing on public services on the one hand, and on the other, those related to the struggles and rights of private debtors. For example, if we don't usually see actually financial consumers as human rights holders, and this has to change, in my view. We need to provide a more comprehensive narrative of on the relation between household debt, weak state services, and massive violation of human rights, including those private debtors for whom contracting and repaying their debts to cover their basic needs or defaulting on repaying should not entail human rights violation. And we also need to make more efforts, in my view, in demanding states, actors, and also international financial institutions to conducting human rights impact assessment of financial policies supporting the provision of goods and services through private debt schemes. And there are indeed some state actors interested in and actually trying to study and anticipate the negative human rights impact of certain economic policies being implemented in this field, such as parliamentarians, women's rights agencies, and national human rights institutions, unions. We need to make greater efforts to elaborate more holistic studies to show how financial policies promoting private debt driving schemes affect human rights. And from there, think of joining agendas and forces. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Juan Pablo. I saw Magdalena did a comeback and I think she left again. In any case, so we have a range of views, and I will also take your point of view, Leilani, on this, on how you see the way forward. So
sure.
you.
Thanks, Sylvain. Yeah, I agree with what everyone has already said. Maybe to underscore some of it, I don't have a theory of change. I'm always asked, like, what's your theory of change? I find it so hilarious. My theory of change is throw everything at it, which is kind of what the other speakers have said too. But I do believe that we can create perfect storms. And I think that does require a variety of elements. Of course, change always comes from the grassroots. That's where it originates generally. And in my own area, I'm seeing tenants, people in informal settlements, people living in homelessness, really rising up in new ways. And I take heart from that. And obviously that's super important. And it's important that as that rising up is happening, that those are actually rights claims and not just a general rising up. I feel that that's super important, because I think that's where we get into issues of accountability, which is the only way this is all going to happen. But of course, people on the ground alone can't do it alone, as the other speakers have said. And I really agree with what Philip said about having to create new coalitions. And it's in fact why I established the Shift, which we call a global movement to secure the right to housing. The idea of the Shift from the very beginning was to create unusual alliances and new partnerships, to say that the old way of sitting in our human rights comfort zone really wasn't going to work. And so, you know, I find these days I'm as likely to be in an alliance with a city government as I am with a grassroots movement. And it's not to say that city governments aren't also violating human rights. Of course they are. But just to say that there's some really unusual, I find myself talking to people in the finance world far more than I ever thought I would. I'm reading the Financial Times every week, you know, that sort of thing, getting outside of my own comfort zone and trying to figure out, you know, what are the leverages for change. One of the things, I was laughing when Philip was saying it, was, you know, like, none of this is sexy. I mean, he didn't use that language, but it's so true. It's like, even this terrible word that I'm stuck with, financialization, it's like, and even the word housing is one of the most boring words in the world, I think. And so I have put it on myself. My job is, I think, to popularize human rights, to popularize the right to housing, to make it all accessible and more interesting and more lively. And it was for that reason, for example, when I was approached by the documentary filmmaker from Sweden, that I agreed to do that documentary, even though it added a whole layer of stress and work for me, and kind of a weirdness being trailed around by cameras. But I felt it was so important, because this documentary can then reach the world in a way that I as an individual can't, and a new embryonic movement like the Shift can't, but the film can. And I think that what I'm talking about there is also putting out in the public domain a competing narrative, but making it loud and clear and accessible, especially to young people, because young people are our energy and this is their future. I mean, you know, very grim reality right now for young people on every front. And so trying to make this stuff of interest to them, and you know, we've seen Greta do that with environmental stuff and climate change. I think we need to do that in all of our sectors and with human rights itself. One of the things I love doing with local governments with whom I'm working quite closely at the moment in my own country is literally get them to say the words. And you'll notice over time, like at first when they say right to housing, it's all like in the back of their mouth, they're not comfortable, their body language is all awkward. And then after a few months of engagement, you start seeing them referring to the right to housing on their own with eloquence and fluency. So I do think, sometimes when I say this stuff, I feel like a bit of a flake and wonder, are people like thinking, oh my God, does she really think she's going to make change, or any of us are going to make change through this kind of language and popularizing? But I do feel strongly about it. And I've seen in the last 6 years, from when I started as rapporteur to when I finished and now, I have seen more uptake. Not just how, of course, there's a global housing crisis, so there's a lot of energy and movement around housing right now, but I've seen a lot of uptake using human rights language and human rights principles and trying to hold governments accountable in ways that I didn't see, let's say, 6 years ago. So I'll end there.
Thank you very much, Leilani. And it's worth, all of you called for greater alliance and working together. And it's worth noting that today, I think all of us made a big effort to already break some barriers and break the silos of working on different rights. And the organizers as well come from a range of backgrounds. That includes ourselves at GIESCR as a human rights organization, Eurodad, ActionAid, Oxfam, also part of the organizers, SID, people who do work more on finance or development. We also have among the organizers some more national organizations that work closely with grassroots movements. So I really think it resonates with your recommendation, and the panel itself, I think, is a reflection of that growing movement and growing coalition. Now we have a couple of minutes left, and we're delighted actually that you already were 8 rapporteurs today with Magdalena, and we have a 9th one that joined us, with the new or upcoming UN Special Rapporteur on the right to water, Pedro. I'm going to mispronounce your name. I'll apologize. Adolfo Agudo, who is going to replace Leo in a few days after Leo presents his last report on privatization this Wednesday. And I saw in the chat that there was lots of interest in the right to water, with private sector lobby, Aquafed being represented very actively. So clearly the private sector is very active in that area. And we're very interested, Pedro, to hear your view as you're taking a new mandate and important work that Leo is leaving with last week.
Thank you, Sylvain. En français, je suis Pedro Arrojo. C'est bien plus simple. En espagnol, c'est plus difficile pour vous. Pedro Arrojo. Well, thank you. First of all, well, as you said, I have been appointed very recently as UN Special Rapporteur on the human rights to safe drinking water and sanitation. So it's a huge challenge and a great honor. Well, of course, it will be difficult, but very exciting. The challenge to take over from Leo after his mandate, no? But in any case, I would like just to express my deep commitment in deepening the action and the recent the report you have done, Leo, on this question that is essential for me. And in this sense, I want to welcome and to thanks for this initiative that is so important, not just because of the topic, but also the importance, I think, of coordinating the action of the different special rapporteurs in different topics that are finally strongly linked. No, so my commitment to continue in this path, in this direction, and thank you very much.
Thank you, Pedro. Thank you very much, and you're closing just on time for the planned end of this panel. And I think Magdalena, you've come back. I don't know if you're.
Yes, I'm back. Apologies, I have an electricity cut. It needed to happen in this important event. I apologize. So at this point, we just need to close down the meeting. I would again like to thank all the experts for joining us, the Global Initiative and the 8 other organizations that we have been organizing this event. It is very important for us to continue working on this issue. It is evident that COVID-19 pandemic and the economic and social crisis that has caused is pushing for more attention about public services, and there is an awareness from citizens around the world, of the average citizens around the world, that it is necessary to have solid public institutions and public services to be resilient and to cope not only with a health pandemic, but also with the environmental crisis that we are living right now. Before closing, I would also like to thank again the 9 organizations that have worked together in this panel. I would like, in organizing this panel, I'm going to mention them again. ActionAid is African Center for Human Rights, Eurodat, the Initiative for Social and Economic Rights, OCFAM, Society for International Development, Public Service International, and Transnational Institute. We're all working together, and we're committed to work with UN experts and academic and communities to continue to push forward the issue. Finally, I would like to just briefly mention that in order to try to change the narrative, several rapporteurs supported by the organizations that I have mentioned has been publishing an op-ed that has been widely disseminated in several news media around the world. Today it was in The Guardian in English. Last week it was in the global Spanish newspaper El País, and there's going to be several other specific country media that are going to be publishing this op-ed. And the idea is really to try to explain to citizens that the importance of public services. I think it is very important, the point mentioned by Philip at the beginning of this session, that we seems to have lost the communication battle. It seems that the lobby for privatization has put us in the defensive. It seems that we need to show when the government should step in instead of being the normal thing to do. And I think that that was a very important point to keep. Without any further ado, I'm going to thank also the translator and all those who have joined us in this panel. Thank you for your audience, and we will keep on working on the topic. Thank you very much to everyone.
Thanks, Magdalena.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Thanks, everyone.